A black soldier, Sergeant Avery Carter, boards a flight home, but a man refuses to let her take her first-class seat. What happens next shocks everyone on board. Avery's powerful response goes beyond reclaiming her seat, it changes everything. Stay tuned for a story of courage, prejudice, and an unforgettable moment. Also, please comment where you're listening from, and if you enjoy this story, subscribe to our channel for more narratives like these. Let's begin. Sergeant Avery Carter's fingers clenched the boarding pass so tightly that her knuckles paled. The vibrant hum of the airport buzzed around her as people rushed past, eager to get to their gates. After 6 long months of sandstorms, sleepless nights, and the relentless pressure of war in Iraq, the sight of bustling civilians in a place as ordinary as an airport seemed foreign to her. Home. She was finally going home. The thought sent a flutter of warmth through her chest, but it was tangled with the heaviness of everything she had experienced, things her family could never fully understand. As she walked through the terminal, the bright digital sign above flashed her flight number, Flight 348 to Boston, now boarding. The announcement echoed over the intercom, breaking through her thoughts. Avery glanced at the boarding pass again, a furrow forming in her brow. First class? She stopped, checking the ticket again, thinking there had to be a mistake. First class wasn't in her usual budget, and it certainly wasn't something she expected after spending months on military transports. Crammed in like sardines with her fellow soldiers. The idea of flying in luxury felt strange, almost wrong. But there it was, clearly printed on her boarding pass, Seat 1A. Whether it was a rare upgrade or a clerical error, Avery wasn't about to argue. After the past 6 months, the idea of some extra legroom didn't sound too bad. She adjusted her backpack on her shoulder and made her way to the gate. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the narrow walkway leading into the plane, the familiar weight of her boots against the metal flooring reminded her of the desert's uneven terrain. The scent of the sterile air-conditioned cabin greeted her when she entered. First class was a world apart from the gritty, chaotic environment she'd just left. It felt like she was stepping into another life, a life that seemed distant, luxurious, and unreal. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant. Your seat is just to your left," a flight attendant said, her voice friendly and polite, though her eyes lingered just a bit longer on Avery's uniform. Avery nodded in response, feeling a little out of place as she walked past the spacious seats. She reached 1A and stowed her military-issued backpack in the overhead compartment. Her hand brushed the smooth, cool leather of the seat as she sat down. The cushion was soft, softer than any seat she had sat in for months. She exhaled slowly, sinking into the comfort. For a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to unwind from the tightly coiled spring she had become overseas. The hum of the plane's air conditioning soothed her, and she let her eyes close briefly, but her peace was short-lived. "Excuse me," a sharp voice broke through her thoughts. "I think you're in the wrong seat." Avery's eyes snapped open and she looked up to see a tall, well-dressed man standing over her, his polished shoes gleaming and his face twisted with annoyance. His gaze flickered over her uniform, his disapproving stare lingering on the combat patches on her arm. "No, sir," Avery said, keeping her voice steady and calm as she held up her boarding pass. "This is my seat." The man's frown deepened, his lips curling in disdain. "First class is for passengers who've paid for it," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Not for whatever this is." He waved a hand dismissively toward her, as if she were an intruder in his world of leather seats and sparkling water. Avery felt her chest tighten, a familiar sensation. She had encountered this kind of reaction before. The judgment, the dismissal. It was something she had learned to live with, whether it was because of her uniform, her background, or even just the way she carried herself. It never got easier, though. Still, she remained calm, her training kicking in. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out the ticket again and holding it out to the man. "This is my seat, sir." For a moment the man just stared at her, clearly taken aback by her calm response. Then, before he could argue further, the flight attendant reappeared, her professional smile firmly in place, "Is there a problem here, sir?" she asked, her tone pleasant, but there was an underlying firmness that suggested she wasn't going to let this escalate. The man huffed, crossing his arms. "Yes, she's sitting in my seat. This is first class. There's obviously been a mistake." The flight attendant raised an eyebrow and looked at Avery's ticket. Then, with a practiced grace, she gave the man a polite but firm smile. "Actually, Sergeant Carter is in the correct seat, sir. You're assigned to 3A. The man blinked, clearly not expecting this response. His face flushed with embarrassment, but instead of apologizing, he muttered something under his breath and stalked off, his shoulders rigid with indignation. Avery watched him go, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She could feel the weight of the other passengers' eyes on her, some curious, others indifferent. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension. She had faced combat, ambushes, and firefights, but this small moment of judgment somehow cut deeper in a way she hadn't anticipated. The flight attendant leaned down toward her, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. "I'm so sorry about that, Sergeant. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Avery shook her head, still feeling the tightness in her chest. "No, I'm fine, thank you." As the flight attendant walked away, Avery stared out the window, watching the airport lights flicker outside. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, and already she felt exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. It was as though every step closer to home came with a new kind of challenge, one she couldn't prepare for the way she had trained for combat. She glanced around at the other passengers. They all looked so at ease, sipping their drinks, flipping through magazines, scrolling on their phones. It was a world she had left behind when she boarded that military transport to Iraq, and now, stepping back into it, she realized how much she had changed, and how much this world hadn't. She closed her eyes again, trying to relax as the engines roared to life, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. She told herself it didn't matter, these small moments, these glances of judgment, they didn't define her. What mattered was that she was going home. The plane roared to life, its engines humming beneath the floor as it ascended into the vast expanse of sky. The view outside the window turned from the hustle of the airport to the clouds, white and thick, stretching into the horizon. Yet, despite the beauty of the scene, Avery couldn't shake the knot in her chest, twisting tighter with each passing second. Her fingers drummed absently on the armrest, the earlier confrontation with the man in first class replaying in her mind. She had faced worse, far worse, in combat zones, but there was something about that brief encounter that stuck with her. It wasn't just the man's dismissive tone or the way he looked down on her. It was the subtle, unspoken message behind his words, "You don't belong here." She had heard it before. Maybe not in the same words, but the sentiment was always the same. The looks people gave her when they saw her in uniform. The surprise when they realized she, a young black woman, was a soldier. The expectation that she didn't belong in certain places, or that her service didn't fit their image of who should be sitting in first class. Avery exhaled slowly, trying to release the tension in her shoulders. She needed a distraction, something to focus her thoughts. Without hesitation, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. It was the same one she had carried with her throughout her deployment. A safe place for her thoughts when the chaos of war became too much to bear. Writing had become a lifeline, a way to process everything she had seen and felt. Here on this plane it was no different. She flipped to an empty page and with a deep breath began to write. "Dear Sir," the words felt stiff at first, formal and detached. She didn't want this to be an angry letter, even though the frustration still simmered beneath the surface. No. She wanted to use this moment to explain, to help someone, even a stranger, understand what it meant to wear the uniform she wore with pride. Avery didn't expect to change anyone's mind with a letter, but maybe, just maybe, she could plant a seed of empathy in someone who had never considered her perspective. Her pen hovered above the paper as she searched for the right words. This wasn't just about her, and it wasn't just about that man. This was about the countless times she had been judged, not for her actions, but for how she looked or what she wore. This was about every soldier who had been overlooked or dismissed, despite the sacrifices they made. How do I explain something like that, she wondered. But once she started writing, the words began to flow, slowly at first, then steadily. She wrote about her time in Iraq, not the combat or the violence, but the camaraderie. The moments of connection between soldiers of all backgrounds. People who came from different places, races, and religions, but were united by a common cause. She wrote about her friend Emma, a soldier who had saved her life during an ambush, and Ahmed, their interpreter who had risked everything to help them. Avery wrote about how these bonds forged in the fires of adversity had taught her the true meaning of humanity, how the uniform she wore represented more than just her service. It represented the sacrifices of every person who stood beside her. And it represented the idea that in the military, differences in appearance, in background, didn't matter. What mattered was the heart, the courage, and the loyalty of those who served. She paused, her pen still hovering above the paper, when a sudden jolt rocked the cabin. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and Avery instinctively glanced around. A few rows ahead, she noticed an elderly woman clutching her armrests, her face pale and tight with fear. Avery had seen that look before, the panic, the fear of losing control in a situation beyond your grasp. Avery leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "It's okay," she said gently. "This is just turbulence. It's normal. Just breathe with me." The woman's eyes darted to Avery's, her knuckles still white on the armrests. Avery nodded encouragingly, giving her a small smile. "You're safe. Just take deep breaths." The woman blinked, visibly calming herself as she followed Avery's lead, her breath slow and steady. After a few moments, the woman relaxed into her seat, her grip loosening on the armrests. She mouthed a quiet thank you, and Avery nodded in return, feeling a small swell of warmth. As Avery settled back into her seat, she caught a glimpse of movement to her left. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the man from earlier, the one who had challenged her right to sit in first class, watching her. His expression was no longer filled with the same disdain it had held before. Instead, there was something softer, more uncertain, like he was seeing her in a new light. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he looked away, embarrassed. Avery wasn't sure what he was thinking, but she felt a shift. Maybe he was beginning to question the assumptions he had made. Maybe he saw her for who she really was, beyond the uniform, beyond the snap judgments. The turbulence eventually subsided, and the plane steadied. Avery tucked her notebook away, realizing she had written far more than she intended. Her fingers brushed the edges of the paper, and she wondered if she would ever give this letter to the man. It wasn't really about him, not entirely. This letter was for everyone who had ever looked at her and assumed they knew her story. It was for the people who would never understand what it was like to wear that uniform and feel both invisible and hypervisible at the same time. She leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with thoughts. The flight would be long, but she had plenty to think about. The man in 3A remained quiet, but every now and then she could feel his eyes on her, as if he was trying to understand something that had never crossed his mind before. Avery didn't expect an apology. She didn't expect much at all, but as the clouds outside turned golden in the setting sun, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, people like him could change. People could learn. The thought brought a faint smile to her lips. The plane began its slow descent into Boston, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin as the golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the floor. Avery closed her notebook with a quiet snap and set it aside, her thoughts finally settling after the turbulence, both in the air and in her mind. She gazed out the window at the city below, its familiar skyline coming into view, and allowed herself to relax, anticipating the warm embrace of her family waiting at the airport. Her heart felt lighter now, but not just because she was nearing home. Writing the letter had given her clarity, a way to release the frustration that had been bubbling inside since the man in first class, had judged her without a second thought. She hadn't expected to find peace in writing, but it had always been her refuge, even in Iraq, where every day brought new uncertainties. Avery glanced around the cabin. The other passengers were preparing for landing, fastening seatbelts, putting away laptops, and stowing bags. She was about to lean back and enjoy the last few minutes of the flight when movement caught her eye. It was him, the man from earlier, the same man who had challenged her place in first class. His steps were hesitant as he approached, and Avery immediately noticed the tension in his face, the redness in his cheeks. His hands fidgeted nervously at his sides, and his eyes darted from the floor to her, back to the floor, and then to her again. This wasn't the confident, dismissive man from earlier. This was someone who seemed unsure of how to even start the conversation. "Sergeant Carter?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he had the right to speak to her at all. Avery's eyes met his, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. There was something different in his gaze now, an apology that hadn't yet reached his lips, a regret that hung in the air between them. I owe you an apology," he began, his words faltering as though he were still searching for the right way to say what needed to be said. "My behavior earlier, it was completely out of line." He swallowed hard, the vulnerability in his voice clear. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have. I judged you before I even knew you." Avery blinked, a little taken aback by the sincerity of his words. She had expected the flight to end without another word exchanged between them, but here he was, standing before her, looking genuinely remorseful. She didn't interrupt him, sensing he had more to say. The man's shoulders slumped slightly as he took a deep breath. "My brother," he said, his voice cracking just enough for Avery to notice the pain behind it. "He was in Iraq, too. He didn't make it home." The air between them grew heavy. Avery's breath caught in her throat, the weight of his admission pressing against her chest. In that moment, the sharpness of his earlier words, the sting of his condescension, all began to make sense. The anger she had seen in his eyes wasn't really about her. It was about something deeper. Grief. Loss. The kind of pain that makes people lash out in ways they might not even fully understand. "When I saw you sitting there," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "I was angry. I didn't know why at first, but then it hit me. I was angry that you were here and he wasn't. I let that anger cloud my judgment." He exhaled deeply, as if finally admitting it aloud took the last of his energy. Avery watched him closely, her own heart softening as she saw the pain reflected in his eyes. She had seen that kind of grief before, in the faces of soldiers who had lost comrades, in the eyes of families receiving the news no one ever wanted to hear. It was raw, overwhelming, and it often manifested in ways that hurt others, even unintentionally. "I'm sorry for your loss," Avery said softly, her voice filled with the kind of understanding that only someone who had faced death could offer. "Truly, it's a weight no one should have to carry." He nodded, his lips pressed together as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice barely audible now. "I shouldn't have taken it out on you. I shouldn't have assumed." Avery held up a hand gently, stopping him. "It's okay," she said, her voice steady and calm, though the words felt heavier than they should. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and I get it. Sometimes grief makes us do things we wouldn't normally do." The man, Ryan, she had learned from the flight attendant earlier, nodded, his eyes cast downward. He seemed to wrestle with something for a moment, as though he wanted to say more but didn't know how to continue. Finally, after a long pause, he cleared his throat. "My brother's name was Luke," he said, his voice softer now, as if speaking the name allowed him to release some of the burden he carried. He believed in judging people by their actions, not their appearance. "I think I forgot that somewhere along the way." Avery nodded, her eyes softening. "We're all in this together, whether we make it back or not," she said gently, echoing a truth she had carried with her since her first deployment. "The uniform we wear isn't just for us. It represents everyone who didn't make it home. That includes your brother." Ryan swallowed hard, visibly touched by her words. His hands trembled slightly as he rubbed them together, trying to ground himself. The weight of guilt was still heavy on him, but Avery could see that a shift had taken place, a recognition that he had misjudged her, and a desire to make things right. Before he could say anything else, Avery reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded letter she had written earlier. She held it out to him, her expression calm but serious. "I wrote this before you came over," she said. "I didn't know if I'd ever give it to you, but now, I think it might help." Ryan looked at the letter, his brow furrowing in surprise. He took it hesitantly, as though unsure if he deserved to read the words inside. His fingers brushed the edges of the paper, his gaze flickering back to Avery. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to read it now," Avery said, offering a small smile. "But when you do, I hope it gives you some peace." Ryan nodded solemnly, clutching the letter as though it were something precious. "I will," he promised, his voice still thick with emotion. "And thank you for everything." Avery simply nodded, feeling that no more words were necessary. There was an understanding between them now, a shared recognition of loss and the weight of sacrifice. As Ryan turned and walked back to his seat, Avery leaned back in hers, staring out the window once more as the plane made its final descent. The clouds parted, revealing the sprawling city below, bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. Boston. Home. The tension that had gripped her earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of relief and reflection. This flight, which had begun with a confrontation born of judgment and grief, had somehow turned into something else entirely. It had become a bridge, one built not on shared experiences, but on a shared understanding of loss, of humanity, of the complexities that lay beneath the surface of every person's story. As the wheels touched down on the runway, Avery felt a sense of closure. She didn't know if Ryan would ever fully understand what it meant to wear the uniform, but he had taken the first step toward understanding her. And that was enough. It was more than she had expected. The plane slowed, taxiing toward the gate. Avery gathered her things, her hand brushing over the notebook once more. She smiled to herself, thinking of the letter now in Ryan's hands. Knowing that sometimes the most important bridges were built in the smallest moments. She was ready to go home, but as the plane came to a stop, she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey with Ryan wasn't quite over yet. Something told her they would cross paths again, and when they did, it would be with a new perspective and a shared commitment to healing. As Avery stepped off the plane and into the bustling Boston terminal, the familiar hum of life back home washed over her like a warm breeze. The distant chatter, the rolling of luggage, the overhead announcements, all of it brought her a sense of comfort. It was a different kind of noise from the constant hum of helicopters, the crackling radios, and the sounds of a war zone. This was the noise of normalcy, the sound of people going about their everyday lives, blissfully unaware of the world she had just returned from. Her heart raced with anticipation as she scanned the crowd, searching for the faces she had been longing to see for the past 6 months. And then, there they were. Her mother stood at the edge of the crowd, her face lit up with a mix of excitement and relief. In her hands she held a large sign that read, "Welcome home, Avery," in bold letters, decorated with colorful hearts and stars. Beside her was Avery's father, tall and broad-shouldered, his stoic expression barely concealing the pride shining in his eyes. And there, standing slightly apart with his arms crossed, was her younger brother Noah, wearing his typical mischievous grin. A lump formed in Avery's throat, and for a moment, the world around her faded away. All she could see was her family, the people who had kept her grounded through every sleepless night, every moment of fear and uncertainty. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, and before she knew it, her mother had broken through the crowd and rushed toward her. "Avery," her mother cried, throwing her arms around her in a tight embrace. "We've missed you so much, baby." Tears streamed down her mother's face, and Avery could feel her own emotions bubbling to the surface. "I missed you too, Mom," Avery whispered, hugging her mother tightly. The familiar scent of her perfume, the warmth of her embrace, it was all so comforting, so safe. After months of harsh conditions and the constant threat of danger, this was the peace she had craved. Her father approached next, his large hand coming down gently on her shoulder. "Welcome home, sweetheart," he said, his deep voice thick with emotion. "We're so proud of you." Avery looked up at him, the pride in his eyes making her heart swell. "Thanks, Dad," she replied, her voice a little shaky. She had always looked up to her father, a man of few words but endless strength, and seeing his approval meant the world to her. Noah, ever the joker, stood off to the side, waiting his turn. As Avery pulled away from her father, Noah stepped forward and nudged her arm. "What took you so long, huh?" he teased, his grin wide. "It's been boring without you." Avery laughed, shaking her head at him. "Trust me, I wasn't on vacation," she said, ruffling his hair playfully. "And I bet you enjoyed not having me around to boss you around for a while." Noah smirked. Maybe a little. But then his smile softened, and for a brief moment he looked at her with something closer to awe. "It's good to have you back, though. We all missed you." Avery's heart warmed at his words. Despite the teasing and playful banter, she knew her brother had worried about her while she was gone. He was still young, just barely out of high school, and the reality of what she did overseas had hit him hard when she first enlisted. Having her back home, safe, was a relief for him too. As they gathered her bags and walked toward the car, Avery couldn't help but feel the weight of everything she had left behind in Iraq. The memories, the tension, the friendships, and the loss, it all clung to her like an invisible shadow. She hadn't told her family about everything that had happened yet, and she wasn't sure how to start. They reached the car, and Avery slid into the back seat while her father loaded her bags into the trunk. As they pulled out of the airport, Avery gazed out the window, watching the city she knew so well flash by. The familiar sights of Boston, streets she had walked 1,000 times, landmarks that felt like home, looked the same, but she knew she had changed. She felt her mother's eyes on her and turned to see her looking at her with concern. "Everything okay, honey?" her mother asked softly, sensing that something was weighing on her. "You look a little distracted." Avery hesitated, unsure how to put her thoughts into words. Part of her didn't want to burden her family with what had happened on the plane. It seemed so small compared to everything else. Yet it lingered in her mind, a reminder that even here, home wasn't always free of conflict. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. "Actually, something did happen on the flight," she began, her voice careful. She glanced at her mother and father, who both turned in their seats to listen. Noah, too, leaned forward from the back seat, suddenly curious. "There was this guy in first class," Avery continued, "and he didn't think I belonged there. He saw me in my uniform and made some assumptions." She paused, feeling the tension in the car rise. Her mother's brow furrowed, and her father's jaw clenched slightly, but they stayed quiet, waiting for her to finish. Avery explained the confrontation, how the man had challenged her place in first class, how the flight attendant had intervened, and how it had all left her feeling a strange mix of anger and sadness. But then she told them about the apology, about how the man had confessed that his brother had served in Iraq and hadn't made it home, how his grief had turned into judgment, and how he had realized he was wrong. Her family listened in silence, their faces shifting from concern to understanding as Avery spoke. When she finished, there was a brief pause before her mother reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of how you handled that, Avery," her mother said, her voice filled with warmth and admiration. "That couldn't have been easy." Avery shrugged, trying to downplay the moment. "It wasn't at first," she admitted, "but then I remembered something my commanding officer used to say. The greatest battles aren't always fought on the battlefield. I guess this was one of those battles." Her father glanced at her through the rearview mirror, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've always had a way of handling things with grace, even when they're tough," he said. "I'm glad you didn't let that guy's ignorance get to you." Noah, who had been quiet until now, piped up from the back seat, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Did you punch him?" he asked eagerly, leaning forward with excitement. Avery laughed, shaking her head. "No, little bro. Sometimes words are stronger than fists." She winked at him, and he grinned in return. As they continued driving through the familiar streets of Boston, Avery felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Telling her family about the encounter had eased some of the tension she hadn't realized she was holding. But more than that, it reminded her that she wasn't alone. Her family was her anchor, her constant, and no matter what happened, whether in Iraq or here at home, they were always there to support her. The car pulled into the driveway of their family home, and as Avery stepped out, she was greeted by the sight of a large banner hanging across the front porch. "Welcome home, Sergeant Carter." It read in bold, colorful letters, and beneath it were balloons and decorations her family had clearly spent hours preparing. Tears welled up in Avery's eyes as she looked at the house, at the home she had missed so much. Her mother came up behind her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Surprise," she said, her voice soft with emotion. "We wanted to make sure you knew how much we missed you." Avery turned to her family, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you all so much." As they made their way inside, the familiar sense of home filled Avery's senses. Her mother's cooking, the faint hint of her father's cologne, and the warmth of the house she had grown up in. It was as if no time had passed at all, yet she knew how much she had changed in the months she had been gone. But here, surrounded by the people who loved her most, Avery knew that no matter what battles she faced, whether on the battlefield or within herself, she had a home to come back to. And that was all she needed. As the evening wore on, they laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the comfort of being together again. For the first time in months, Avery felt truly at peace. This was home. This was where she belonged, and no judgment, no prejudice, could ever take that away from her. The evening had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Avery sat in the living room, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home, the soft creak of the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the warmth of her family bustling in the kitchen. Her mother was prepping dinner, her father flipping through the evening news, and Noah was sitting cross-legged on the floor, pretending to scroll through his phone but clearly listening to every word of the conversation between their parents. For the first time in months, Avery allowed herself to relax, her guard down, knowing she was in the safety of her own space. She sank deeper into the plush sofa, a cup of tea in hand, her thoughts wandering back to Iraq, back to her deployment, and then, unexpectedly, back to the plane. She had tucked the encounter with Ryan away in her mind, believing that chapter had closed with his apology. The letter she gave him had been a release for her, a way to let go of the weight she had been carrying. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. That's why the sudden knock at the front door startled her. Her mother wiped her hands on a towel and moved toward the door, looking over her shoulder at Avery. "Were you expecting someone, honey?" Avery shook her head, her brows furrowing in confusion. "No, I wasn't." She sat up straighter, setting her tea on the coffee table as her mother opened the door. Standing on the front porch, looking slightly out of place against the warm, homely backdrop of their suburban neighborhood, was Ryan, the man from the plane. He was dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, but his hands were stuffed nervously in his pockets, and his eyes darted around as though unsure of what to do next. "I hope I'm not intruding," Ryan said, his voice uncertain. He cleared his throat awkwardly before his eyes landed on Avery, who was standing now, her confusion plain on her face. Her mother, sensing the tension, gave a polite but curious smile. "Can I help you?" Avery stepped forward. "It's okay, Mom, I know him." She gave her mother a reassuring nod, though inwardly she was still grappling with the surprise of seeing him here of all places. "This is Ryan. We met on the flight." Her mother's expression softened into one of understanding, but she didn't linger. "Well, I'll leave you two to it," she said, disappearing into the kitchen with a knowing glance toward Avery. Ryan took a tentative step forward, offering an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry to just show up like this, but I read your letter." Avery's surprise deepened. She hadn't expected him to actually read the letter, let alone seek her out afterward. "Already?" she asked, her voice reflecting the disbelief she felt. Ryan nodded, his face tightening with the weight of what he was about to say. "I couldn't wait," he admitted. "Your words, they hit me hard. I've spent so much time angry, blaming the world, blaming anyone for my brother's death. But after reading what you wrote, I realized I've been dishonoring his memory." Avery motioned for him to come inside. "You don't have to stand out there. Come in." Ryan stepped into the house, his eyes scanning the cozy living room with its family photos on the wall, the soft, worn furniture, and the comforting scent of home-cooked food wafting from the kitchen. He seemed out of place, standing there in his own discomfort, but Avery could sense the vulnerability behind his nervous demeanor. They sat down on the couch, the same spot where Avery had just been unwinding moments before. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but Ryan was the first to break the silence. "I spent a long time angry at the world," he said, his voice quieter now, as though admitting the truth was difficult. "When Luke died in Iraq, I didn't know where to put that grief, so I turned it into anger. I blamed the military, the government, the people who sent him there, and eventually just anyone who wore a uniform. It wasn't fair. And when I saw you on the plane—" His voice trailed off, shame flickering in his eyes. Avery nodded, understanding more now than she had on the plane. "It's easy to let grief turn into anger," she said softly. "I've seen it happen to so many people who lose someone they love. But it doesn't make it any easier to carry." Ryan let out a shaky breath. "Exactly. It's been 2 years since Luke passed, but I've been holding on to this bitterness like it would somehow make sense of everything. But your letter—" He paused, pulling the letter from his pocket and unfolding it carefully, as though it were something fragile. "The way you wrote about your experience in Iraq, the way you described your friendships with your fellow soldiers, people from all walks of life, it reminded me of how Luke used to talk about his unit." He stared down at the letter, his hand shaking slightly. "Luke always believed in the mission. He believed in what he was doing, and he believed in the people he served with. I think I forgot that. I've spent so much time being angry that I stopped remembering who he was." Avery's heart ached for him. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who had lost friends, who had come home carrying the invisible weight of guilt and sorrow. She had carried it herself, more times than she cared to admit. "I wrote that letter because I wanted you to know that what we do, what your brother did, it matters," Avery said gently. "Even when it feels like the world doesn't understand, even when people don't see the sacrifices. We carry each other, even when we're worlds apart." Ryan nodded, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. He blinked them back, trying to compose himself. "I've been dishonoring his memory," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "By being so angry. I was forgetting the man he was, the man who believed in something bigger than himself. I wasn't honoring his legacy. I was drowning in my own grief." Avery reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Grief is heavy," she said softly, "but you don't have to carry it alone, and you don't have to let it turn into something that destroys you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Ryan's words hanging between them. Avery could see the shift in him, the way his shoulders seemed to relax, the way the tension in his face had softened. He was still grieving, but there was a new light in his eyes, a glimmer of understanding, of hope. After a long pause, Ryan spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You've given me a lot to think about, more than you know." Avery smiled gently. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "Sometimes, all it takes is a conversation. We all need someone to help us see things from a different perspective." Ryan nodded, wiping at his eyes quickly before he could fully break down. "You've done that for me. I'd like to do something to honor Luke's memory, something meaningful. I don't want to keep carrying this anger." Avery's mind whirred with possibilities, but one thought stood out above the rest. "Have you ever considered getting involved with veteran support groups?" she asked. There are a lot of people who could benefit from hearing your story, hearing how you're trying to heal. It might help them heal too." Ryan looked at her, surprised by the suggestion, but after a moment he nodded slowly. "That's not a bad idea," he said. "I've never thought of it that way, but maybe that's exactly what I need. Maybe that's what Luke would have wanted." Avery smiled. "I think he'd be proud of you." They sat for a while longer, talking about Iraq, about grief, and about finding ways to move forward. Ryan shared stories about Luke, their childhood, Luke's dedication to the military, and the brotherly bond they had shared. Avery in turn shared stories of her deployment, of the friendships she had forged in the harshest of conditions and the people who had become like family to her. By the time Ryan left, his bitterness had melted away, replaced by a sense of peace Avery hadn't seen in him before. He thanked her once again, this time with genuine warmth in his voice, and as he walked out the door, Avery couldn't help but feel that this conversation had been more than just a chance encounter. It had been a bridge, a connection forged in the midst of grief and understanding. As the door clicked shut behind him, Avery leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of the day slowly lift from her shoulders. She hadn't expected this visit, but it had brought with it a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Back in the living room, her mother peeked out from the kitchen, her brow raised in curiosity. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. Avery smiled, the warmth of the moment still lingering in her chest. "Yeah, everything's okay," she said softly. "It was just something unexpected." Her mother gave her a knowing look, as though she understood far more than Avery had said, and disappeared back into the kitchen. Avery sat down on the couch once more, sinking into the cushions. She picked up her cup of tea, now cold, and stared out the window, her thoughts turning to the future. She had come home from Iraq thinking her journey was over, but now she realized it was just beginning. There were more bridges to build, more connections to make. In the weeks that followed Ryan's unexpected visit, Avery found herself driven by a new sense of purpose. The conversation with him had sparked something in her, a realization that the battles she had fought in Iraq weren't the only ones that mattered. There were battles to be fought at home too. Battles of understanding, empathy, and bridging the divide between veterans and civilians. She knew that her experiences, and those of countless others, held the power to change perspectives. And she was determined to make sure those stories were heard. It started small. Ryan invited her to attend a meeting of the Veterans Support Group he had been a part of since his brother's death. It was a modest gathering at first, just a few veterans sitting in a circle at a local community center, sharing their struggles, their grief, and their hopes for the future. Ryan had told them about Avery, about the letter she had written, and how it had shifted something inside him. At first, Avery was hesitant to share. These were people who had seen and lived through their own pain, and she wasn't sure if her story would resonate. But when she spoke, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, she saw the way they listened. She spoke about her time in Iraq, about the friendships she had formed and the losses she had endured. She spoke about the bond that soldiers forge with one another, a bond that transcends race, background, and differences. And she spoke about the struggle to come home, to reintegrate into a world that often didn't understand what it meant to serve. As she finished speaking, there was a moment of silence, and then, one by one, the veterans in the group began to share their own stories. Some had fought in Vietnam, others in Desert Storm or Afghanistan, but they all understood the same weight, the same burden of coming home and feeling out of place. It was in that circle that Avery realized something profound. Her story wasn't just hers. It was part of a collective experience, a shared history that connected every soldier who had ever served. Ryan, sitting across from her, nodded in silent approval, his eyes filled with gratitude. That night, as they packed up the chairs and cleaned up the room, Ryan pulled her aside. "You should speak more," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "People need to hear this. They need to hear what you have to say." Avery hesitated, her instinct to shy away from the spotlight kicking in. "I don't know, Ryan. I'm just one person. There are so many other stories." "That's the point," Ryan interrupted gently. You're one person, but you represent all of us. Your story, my brother's story, everyone's story, it all matters. And you have a way of making people listen." Avery looked at him, her mind racing. She had never thought of herself as a public speaker, but Ryan was right. People needed to understand what veterans went through, not just the trauma of war, but the struggle to come back and be seen as more than just a uniform. And so, Avery threw herself into the mission. She started working with Ryan and the support group, expanding their reach, inviting more veterans to join. They organized panels and community discussions, where veterans of all backgrounds could share their experiences. Avery found herself speaking more and more, not just at the group meetings, but at schools, churches, and local events. She quickly realized that people wanted to listen, they wanted to understand, and that gave her hope. Her talks resonated with people, civilians who had never known what it was like to serve, but who were eager to learn. She spoke about the importance of compassion, of looking beyond the uniform to see the person underneath. She told stories about her fellow soldiers, about Emma, the soldier who had saved her life in Iraq, and about Ahmed, the interpreter who had risked everything to help them. She shared her own journey of returning home, of dealing with the subtle judgments and the misunderstandings, and how those experiences had shaped her. At every event, the audience would sit in silence, captivated by her words, their faces reflecting a mix of awe, sadness, and newfound understanding. Afterward, people would approach her, thanking her for opening their eyes, for making them see veterans in a new light. One afternoon, as she stood at the podium in a packed community center, Avery scanned the crowd before her. It was one of the largest gatherings she had spoken to yet. Rows of seats stretched out in front of her, filled with civilians, veterans, students, and families. In the front row sat Ryan, his expression one of quiet pride. Beside him was her family, her mother, father, and Noah, all beaming with support. The sight of them there, so proud of what she had become, filled her with a sense of warmth. She took a deep breath and began. "We all have the power to build bridges," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It starts with listening. It starts with being open to perspectives that are different from our own. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it's hard, but it's necessary. Because when we listen, we start to understand. And when we understand, we can start to heal." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. She could see the faces in the crowd, some nodding, others leaning forward, intent on her every word. "Iraq taught me many things," Avery continued. "It taught me about courage and sacrifice, yes, but it also taught me about humanity. I served with people from all walks of life, people I would have never met if not for the military. And together, we formed bonds that went deeper than I ever imagined. Those bonds are what got us through the hardest days. They're what reminded us that no matter how different we seemed on the outside, we were all the same on the inside. We were a family." She glanced down at her notes, but she didn't need them anymore. The words flowed naturally, born from the truth she had lived. "When I came home, I thought I was leaving that behind. But I realized that the mission isn't over. The work isn't done. Because we have to build those same kinds of bonds here in our own communities. We have to look at each other and see the humanity, see the person, not just the label." Avery looked out into the crowd, catching Ryan's eye. He smiled and she smiled back. "We can all be bridge builders," she said, her voice softening but still firm. "We can all be part of the healing process. It starts with a conversation, it starts with listening, and it starts with compassion." The room was silent for a moment as her words hung in the air, and then the applause began. It started softly, then grew louder, filling the space with an energy that made Avery's heart swell. She smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This was her purpose now. She had faced battles on the battlefield, but now she was fighting a new kind of battle, one for understanding, one for compassion, and one for change. As she stepped down from the podium, her family rushed forward to embrace her. Her mother hugged her tightly, tears of pride in her eyes. "You were amazing, honey," she whispered. Her father clapped her on the shoulder, his usual stoic expression giving way to a wide grin. "I always knew you'd do something incredible," he said. Noah, ever the teasing brother, punched her lightly on the arm. "You're like a superhero now, huh?" he joked, though his admiration was clear. Avery laughed, pulling him into a quick hug. "Yeah, something like that." As the crowd began to disperse, Ryan approached, his face filled with emotion. "You did it," he said quietly. "You're changing lives, Avery." She smiled at him, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within her. "We did it," she corrected. "Together." Ryan nodded, the weight of everything they had been through together reflected in his eyes. "I think Luke would have been proud of us," he said softly. Avery's heart swelled at the mention of Ryan's brother. "I think he would have been too." As the evening drew to a close, Avery stood outside the community center, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The warmth of her family surrounded her, and the sense of purpose that had been ignited in her heart continued to burn brightly. There were more bridges to build, more conversations to have, but she knew she was on the right path. Avery had found her mission, and with every step forward, she was helping to create a world where understanding and compassion could flourish. This was the beginning of a new kind of service, a service of the heart. And Avery Carter, soldier, daughter, and bridge builder, was ready for the journey ahead. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the backyard. Avery sat on the porch steps, her gaze lost in the vibrant colors painting the evening sky. It had been a long day, but one filled with a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't felt in a long time. The applause from her speech, the warmth of the crowd's reception, and the proud faces of her family were still fresh in her mind, lingering like a sweet memory. For the first time in a while, Avery felt at peace, not the fleeting kind of peace that comes and goes, but a deeper, more lasting sense of calm that settled in her chest like an anchor. The faint chirping of crickets filled the air, blending with the gentle rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Her house, the place she had grown up in, stood behind her, its windows glowing with the warm, welcoming light of home. From the porch, she could hear the muffled voices of her parents and Noah talking in the kitchen, laughter occasionally breaking through the walls. It was a simple moment, but one she had longed for during her time in Iraq. A buzzing from her phone broke her out of her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen, expecting a message from one of her family members or perhaps a friend checking in. Instead, it was from Ryan. "Great speech today. Luke would have been proud." A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth as she read the words. There was something about Ryan's acknowledgement that struck a chord deep within her. The journey they had been on together, starting from that tense, awkward encounter on the plane to this new place of mutual understanding, felt almost surreal. Who would have thought that a stranger who had once misjudged her could now become a friend and ally? Avery typed back a simple message. "Thank you, Ryan. I couldn't have done it without your support." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "I think Luke would be proud of you too." As she hit send, a sense of warmth spread through her, and she leaned back against the porch railing, letting the evening air envelop her. The past few weeks had been transformative in ways she hadn't anticipated. When she first returned home from Iraq, she thought her mission was over, but now she understood that her new mission had only just begun. And this time, it wasn't about combat or survival. It was about building bridges, healing wounds, and bringing people together. Her thoughts drifted back to her speech earlier that day, to the way the audience had responded, not just with applause but with genuine engagement. She had seen the looks on their faces, looks of curiosity, empathy, and understanding. It wasn't easy to bridge the gap between veterans and civilians, but in that moment, Avery knew she had made a difference. And she knew that this was only the beginning. As the sky darkened, the stars began to flicker into view, one by one. Avery closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air. She thought about the path that lay ahead, about the speeches she would give, the veterans she would meet, the civilians she would connect with. There was so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't overwhelmed by it. Instead, she felt energized by the possibilities, by the idea that every conversation she had could make the world a little bit better, a little more understanding. The door creaked open behind her, and Avery's mother stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Avery, then sat down beside her on the steps. For a moment, neither of them spoke, content to share the quiet evening together. "I'm proud of you, you know," her mother said softly, breaking the silence. Avery smiled, glancing at her mother. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." Her mother took a sip of her tea, her gaze fixed on the stars overhead. "You've always been strong. Even as a little girl, you had this determination. But it's more than that now. You've found your purpose." Avery nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I think so. It took me a while, but I know now what I meant to do." Her mother turned to look at her, her eyes filled with the kind of wisdom that only years of life experience can bring. "Building bridges isn't easy. But you're the right person for it, Avery. You have a way of seeing people, really seeing them, for who they are." Avery didn't respond right away. She let her mother's words sink in, feeling the truth of them. She had always been someone who tried to understand others, even when it wasn't easy. That trait had served her well in the military, and now it would serve her in this new chapter of her life. "I just hope I can make a difference," Avery said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "You already have," her mother replied, her tone gentle but firm. "Look at what you've done in just a few weeks. People are listening to you, Avery. They're learning from you. And they'll continue to learn because you're not giving up. You're creating real change." Avery looked down at her mug, the steam rising in the cool night air. She thought about the veterans she had spoken with, the civilians who had approached her after her talks, thanking her for opening their eyes. She thought about Ryan, who had started his journey of healing because of their conversation, and the countless others who were still carrying the weight of misunderstanding and judgment. There was still so much work to do, but her mother was right. She had already made a difference, and she wasn't going to stop now. The 2 women sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, sipping their tea and watching the stars. Avery's thoughts drifted to the future, speaking engagements, veteran outreach, perhaps even a book or a larger initiative to help bridge the gap between veterans and civilians on a national scale. The possibilities felt endless, but for the first time they didn't feel daunting. They felt exciting. After a while, her mother stood up, brushing off her hands. "Well, I'll leave you to your thoughts," she said, smiling warmly. "But don't stay out here too long. It's getting chilly." Avery laughed softly. "I won't, Mom. Thanks for the tea." Her mother disappeared back inside, leaving Avery alone with her thoughts once more. She glanced at her phone again, reading Ryan's message one more time. "Luke would have been proud." The words resonated with her in a way that went beyond their literal meaning. It wasn't just Luke who would have been proud. It was all the veterans who had come before her, the ones who had paved the way, the ones who had fought and sacrificed so that people like her could continue the mission of understanding and compassion. Avery stood up, stretching her arms above her head as the cool night air wrapped around her. She took one last look at the stars, feeling a sense of clarity wash over her. Her mission was clear now, to build bridges, one conversation at a time, to bring people together, and to foster understanding in a world too often divided by fear and prejudice. With her family by her side, her newfound purpose driving her forward, and the support of people like Ryan and the veterans she had connected with, Avery Carter, soldier, daughter, and bridge builder, was ready for whatever the future held. As she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, she felt a sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new conversations, and she was ready. What do you think about Avery's story? Have you ever faced a moment where someone judged you without truly knowing who you were? How would you have responded in her shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you in the next video.